I don't know about you, but May feels like a lifetime ago. Back then, football was suspended and leagues didn't know when they would come back. Financial uncertainty reigned supreme. But nowhere was this feeling stronger than in the EFL.
We are heading for a financial hole of about £200 million by the end of September, a cash hole.
This could last for a year, it could last for 2 months, it could last for 6. Nobody knows at this moment in time. And so what football has to do, it has got to plan for the worst case scenario.
And with dozens of clubs at risk of bankruptcy, many within the game thought change was necessary.
Our avowed aim is to emerge stronger, leaner, more efficient, to have a proper reset post-COVID.
I am 95% certain that the whole of the EFL, including the Championship, will be under a salary cap structure from the start of this next season.
After months of talk, Leagues 1 and 2 have finally agreed on hard salary caps for their respective leagues starting this season. The rules have caused debate amongst fans, clubs, and pundits.
It is simply stunning. I cannot believe this decision has decided to go ahead today, and it's just going to spell all sorts of chaos now for the league. You're punishing the clubs that can bring in the ticket and gate revenue, you know.
There's obviously a salary cap coming into the EFL, and I think that will help make the leagues more sustainable, because every year a few clubs do live beyond their means.
Just say I've suddenly got a load of millions, and my dream is to pump my money into the football club I've loved all my life. Well, a salary cap makes that pointless. You know, I could go and build a nice ground, but I can't spend it on wages to take my team higher up the leagues and into the Premier League and achieve the goal.
Today, we explain the new rules and ask, what do they mean for the leagues and for English football?
I don't think it's going to be hugely significant because we already have a salary cap.
Kieran Maguire is a football finance expert working at Liverpool University and co-host of the Price of Football podcast.
In League 1, it's 60% for wages on income, and in League 2, it's 50%. So it already exists. So we're changing one set of acronyms for another. It will put a little further downward pressure on the employment market in terms of wages, but I don't think it'll be that significant.
Before we kind of get into the ins and outs of this cap, let's kind of talk about the cause of this cap. What prompted this change, and how bad are the finances at League 1 and League 2 right now?
Clubs in League 1 and League 2, they are losing money in the main, but there are some which are breaking even. There have been concerns expressed by some owners that others are playing fast and loose in terms of their willingness to pay wages, which is resulting in clubs A, going into losses, but B, causing an arms race in terms of the clubs which are running on a break-even model. They potentially going to lose players because they're offered more elsewhere to clubs which are losing money and operating in a more precarious environment. So I think that was a contributory factor. There's also political pressure here in the UK from government. So to a certain extent, it's a case of being seen to be doing something as much as doing something in terms of implementing another set of financial controls.
So would this be happening if not for the current pandemic?
I think whether the vote would have been passed in League 1, because the vote was very much on the cusp. You had to have 2/3 majority in each division. In League 2, it was 22 in favour of the hard cap. In League 1, it was only 16. So I think potentially you could have lost that particular vote. And by all accounts, in the Championship, it was rejected because there is no hard cap coming in the Championship. I think one of the levers that were used by the people supporting the hard cap was, if we don't introduce it, then central government will. And that was used as sort of the boogeyman in the conversation.
Let's break down some of these proposed, rule changes. What does the salary cap look like now?
The salary cap is in respect of players only. So it's a squad cap, I think it's been described as. it excludes young players at £2.5 million in League One. That works out as around about £113,000 per player for a 22-man squad, assuming you've got no under-21s there. The average wage in that division is probably around about £25,000 a year higher. So it's not huge, and I think that wages would have fallen naturally as a result of the pandemic this summer anyway. So you've got to be careful with salary caps because people become very emotional about them, but a lot depends on where the cap is to the market level of wages.
So you said typically players make around £130,000 per year in League One, and that will go down to around £113,000. Can you put that into context? How does that compare to the Championship, where obviously wages are much higher?
Yeah, the average wage in the Championship is around about £750,000 a year. So yeah, you do the maths. The club gets relegated and it can afford 3 players in League One. So as a result of that, there are transitional rules. So if a club is relegated from the Championship to League One, players on existing contracts, if they're on £750,000 a year, they will still receive that money because that's their contractual entitlement. But for the salary cap purposes, they will be deemed to be earning just the average wage in that lower division. So I can see the rationale behind that. It's trying to compromise on company law, employment law, and things of that nature. But it's not actually going to drive wages down for a couple of years. We're facing a very short-term crisis in football, and this is sort of a medium-term solution.
Do those numbers of 2.5 million in League One and then 1.5 million in League Two sound right to you, or should they be higher? Because I know I've seen a lot of people online suggest that it should be higher.
Well, if you had it much higher, then you'd have many clubs coming under the cap, so it wouldn't have a huge impact. If the objective, and remember we do have a soft salary cap at present, which has worked reasonably successfully in my view in Leagues 1 and 2. If we allowed the cap to go much higher, then it would be broadly similar to where we are at present. There's not a huge amount of wage inflation in Leagues 1 and 2. There has been a significant wage inflation in the Championship. So the irony, of course, is that the one division which does need potentially a wage cap is the one which is least likely to have one in place.
You mentioned earlier that these clubs were worried about the government, stepping in. Was it really that close?
I personally don't think so. I think it was a fear. Yeah, the government has one or two more issues which are slightly more pressing at present in terms of its macro and microeconomic policy. So to start getting involved with football. But certainly if you take a look at the pronouncements from the Department for Culture, Media and Sport, they have been suggesting that some form of regulator or regulation is potentially on the cards. And what we have at present in football is self-regulation, and that's something which club owners like. They don't want a third party telling them what they can and cannot do. So I don't think it was a genuine issue in the short term of the government introducing new legislation, because they've got pandemic-related issues to focus on. But it's certainly on a longer term basis, it could have been a challenge, I think, for the way that clubs are being governed and owned and run, because as we've seen in terms of events over the course of the last couple of years, Bury, Morecambe, Bolton, Charlton, Sunderland, some would say, although the owners wouldn't say that, and there are many other clubs who have also failed to pay wages. Self-regulation doesn't seem to work particularly well.
Let's look at some of the negatives or some of the objections that people are raising about this. What about big clubs like Sunderland who have a high turnover or revenue? You're limiting the amount those clubs can spend on players. So is all that money now kind of going to the owner? What happens to that money now?
Let's park the pandemic. Let's assume that that Sunderland were playing in front of crowd's 25, 30,000, whatever it's going to be. If the club is profitable, then those profits belong to the shareholders, effectively the owners. So yes, it could have meant that Sunderland would have been constrained as far as their ability to use that piece of competitive advantage. And that's what having big crowds does. It gives you a competitive advantage. So I think some of the big clubs were the ones that voted against, the likes of Sunderland, Portsmouth, Ipswich, who were already in League One. Remember, there were 7 votes against. I suspect that the clubs relegated, the likes of Hull, Charlton, and Wigan, might have been reluctant to commit to those as well. So it was by far from being a unanimous choice. For every loser, there's a winner. So if you were associated with one of the smaller clubs, then I think you'd have been very much in favour of it, because it gives the likes of Rochdale and Accrington and so on a greater chance of success in Leagues 1 and 2 in terms of getting promoted, in the case of League 1 clubs, to the Championship. You don't necessarily need to spend big money on wages, and I think that was evidenced by what happened with Wycombe Wanderers this season. But it does become more of a challenge. But I am concerned that what we appear to have now is sort of a hodgepodge of rules which are very inconsistent with one another. There's no wage cap in the Premier League, which pays the highest wages. That seems paradoxical. There's no wage cap in the Championship, which has got the highest losses in European football, but there are in Leagues 1 and 2, where the owners tend to be more localised.
So are you concerned that there might be a big gap between the Championship and League 1 now, like that, chasm will kind of grow over time?
Yes, it means there is the real potential now for Premier League 2. And to a certain extent, we were starting to see that manifest itself. If you take a look at the number of times the likes of Wigan, Barnsley, Rotherham, and so on, Charlton now, are being relegated and promoted, there is far more of a yo-yo effect between the Championship and League 1 than there is between the Premier League and the Championship. And that is due to the financial gaps between those two divisions. So this wage cap is going to reinforce that competitive gap, and it is going to be, to a certain extent, promoting PL2, which I don't think was the intention of the people that voted in favour of the cap.
But it's kind of led, maybe indirectly to that a little bit.
Yeah, I think it could be an indirect consequence, an unintentional one. Now, club owners might say, well, actually, we're quite happy being in League 1. Yes, we'd love to, put in a challenge for a playoff place or things of that nature. And we feel that the salary cap will give us an opportunity, even if it's just to have 1 year in the sun, to a certain extent, of playing in the Championship and playing against those big clubs, the likes of Sheffield Wednesday, Middlesbrough, Derby, Forest, Norwich, and so on. And that could work. It can work well, or it could work unwell. Yeovil managed promotion a few years ago to the Championship, and to a certain extent that was a disaster for the club, because it's now dropped down into non-league relatively quickly afterwards. So we'll have to wait and see what the consequences are in terms of promotion and relegation. But if financial security is deemed to be of greater importance than which division you're in, then the rules are as they are.
Now, perhaps the biggest objectors to this is actually not even big clubs, but the players themselves. What have you heard, from the PFA or from players about this?
Well, from the PFA, it's their job to look after the interests of their members, and their view is that the proposals are unenforceable and illegal. I think they will be consulting their silver-tongued friends in the legal profession with regards to this. But you've got to also observe that players on existing contracts, they will not be forced to take pay cuts. Again, what will happen is that if you've got a player who's in League One, playing in League One on £5,000 a week, and he's got 2 years remaining on a contract, that £5,000 a week will still be paid to the player, but only the average wage in the division will count towards to this squad cap total. So there are transitional rules which will soften the blow. But I'm aware of players in League 2 on £250,000 a year compared to the target from the cap of around about 80. So I think there will be a challenge in the medium term as those contracts expire. Now, is it going to mean that clubs in lower leagues are going to struggle to attract players? There will always be somebody willing to play for the club. £80,000 a year is still a decent wage for a working young man. It might be less than he was hoping to earn. There could be consequences in terms of the number of players who come to play and ply their trade in the UK as a result of that. But then that was going to be the case under Brexit anyway, because it's going to be that much harder to recruit players. So I think the likes of the clubs in League Two being able to attract players from the continent and offer them an attractive wage and also pass what appears to be fairly severe tests set up by the Home Office is going to be very challenging.
So what are the next steps? How do you think this is going to play out, going forward in the, short, medium future?
I think short term, and we did see this before the cap was announced, in the very short term, there was a sort of a mini transfer window where clubs were actually desperately, but those clubs that could afford to pay more in the lower leagues were signing up players the week before the vote went. Because if you sign somebody on £200,000 a year on a 3-year contract in League One, the week before the vote took place, that contract, as far as the EFL are concerned, is only for the average wage of that division. So we've been through that very short-term burst of signing players. For the rest of this summer, I think there's going to be a downward force on wages, partly due to the pandemic, partly due to the fact that there are 1,400 players out of contract. So expect to see some downward pressure. As contracts expire, for those players who did have their contracts signed prior to the date of the vote, that will also put downward pressure gently, I think, on wage levels. Not horrendous, and therefore we will see that as an issue. So I think losses for the clubs in the lower leagues potentially are going to fall. As for the clubs coming down from the Championship, they are to a certain extent protected from the rules because of the nature of the transition. So I think those clubs, in the short term, upon being relegated, will be relatively unaffected.
Are you a fan of football today? Then why not support the show and sign up to our new Patreon page? You'll get access to bonus episodes, full interviews, and extra content. Just go on Patreon and search Football Today. Now, back to the episode. Even though salary caps are rare in British sports, in American sports, they're typical. To look at them on a deeper level, we spoke with Noah Croom, who is recently an assistant general manager for the Minnesota Timberwolves and who has worked in the NBA for more than 20 years. He is now General Counsel and Partner at the Beautiful Game Group.
It's become very important. Originally, it was instituted with the stated intent of preserving competitive balance, but it's really become an important cost containment measure for teams and also an essential part of planning for front offices as they plot to retain their own free agents and acquire other teams' free agents.
So what are some of the different ways that the salary cap influences kind of decision-making processes in a front office?
There is a lot of time spent planning with respect to signing your own free agents, particularly if you have a player on a rookie deal who will be coming up for his extension. You certainly want to have enough room to sign him. So it really affects your ability to keep your own players going forward and also affects your ability to sign other teams' free agents. And there's a lot of strategy involved in making sure that you have room under the cap to sign players when there's a particularly good free agent class. And you also have to monitor other teams' potential cap space as they plot to sign your players.
So in essence, it makes it harder to kind of retain your own players, but you also need that kind of flexibility to then be able to maneuver to get other players. And really, you're kind of getting at that flexibility, which is a big issue when you have a salary cap.
Yes. And, I don't know how much planning goes on currently in League One and League Two, but I think it actually makes teams really focus on their budgets for players' salaries and really look forward into the future 2 or 3 years to make sure that they are within the constraints of the cap, and really makes them much better planners than they were in a non-cap environment.
Oh, that's really interesting. So it forces them to look more long-term and be more sustainable, really, kind of.
Yes, I would argue that one of the reasons NBA front offices have grown in numbers and have become more professional is administering the cap and understanding the complexities of the cap.
And one of the other things that, just as a basketball fan myself, it seems that it's also done is it rewards teams that have better front offices and better, general managers, and negatively affects more, teams that are poorly run.
I would agree with that 100%. Keep in mind, there was an era when GMs were often former players who had successfully played for a franchise, and they were elevated to the role of lead decision maker, often without a lot of formal training. Some were successful, some were not. And what we've seen in the last 15 years is the advent of people with, I'd say, more professional backgrounds, lawyers, business people, and we've seen this throughout sports here in North America. Leadership in front offices has become, I would argue, more professionalized.
I think one interesting way in which NBA teams have tried to get around the cap is by structuring contracts. A lot of contracts are either front-loaded or back-loaded. Can you explain that system or, why teams do that?
Oftentimes over the course of negotiations, teams and players will agree on the gross number that a player is to be paid over an agreed upon number of years. And teams are given some flexibility on how the money is allocated. And so if you know that there will be a particular player that you are interested in, let's say on another team, you may want to have a player's contract front loaded so that when you get to that year, 2 or 3 years in the future, you have created additional space. Sometimes teams will only guarantee a percentage of a player's contract, which will allow them to terminate that player and reduce the amount of money that goes on their cap. So teams have gotten very good at manipulating the amount of space that they'll have in a given season. And that gets us to one thing I think that we've seen over the course of the cap in the NBA is that teams become very clever in finding loopholes. And there's this constant game of what I'll refer to as cat and mouse, where teams find loopholes in the cap and then the league office seeks to plug them. Now, loopholes are very different than circumvention. And circumvention is, in essence, cheating. And there's a fair amount of circumvention that goes on as well. And really that involves teams conferring benefits on players outside their contracts. And so whether that's in the form of business ventures or gifts or other things given to the players' family members or friends or agents. So it's really important to have a pretty sophisticated monitoring system, and whether that's forensic accountants or others who can go into teams and examine their books and ferret out circumvention. And it's important that there are stiff penalties to discourage teams from circumventing the cap.
Yeah, I think I remember, Mark Cuban, there was always rumors that Mark Cuban might be able to backhand get some people that signed for Dallas, some money outside of the club, outside the team.
Yes.
So that's what you're referring to.
Yes. And as you can imagine, many owners have vast empires, and there are often opportunities for players to enter into business ventures alongside owners. And so the league has to monitor those very carefully to make sure that teams are not circumventing the salary cap.
So In Leagues 1 and 2, the salary cap was mainly set up as a way of keeping their finances sustainable. And in America, you mentioned earlier, one of the reasons for the salary cap, one of the main reasons, was to promote parity. Would you say that the salary cap has promoted parity or it has decreased parity?
Yeah, I think originally one of the arguments was that the league is only as strong as its weakest team. And so the cap was designed to put teams on a level playing field, thereby promoting parity. I think over time, what it's really done is give owners cost certainty. I think one of the reasons franchise values have risen so dramatically in the U.S. is because of the implementation of salary caps, because now owners have cost certainty. They know what their greatest expense is, and so as revenues have risen, they've known they've been able to contain cost, and that's why franchises, in my opinion, why their value has risen so rapidly.
So, I know you're not an expert in valuations of clubs in League 1 and League 2, but, by that reasoning, do you think that there's a chance that, owners of those clubs might be getting some more phone calls from investors or people trying to take over those clubs in the future?
I wouldn't be surprised, and I would anticipate that if the cap is administered properly, teams will be run more professionally and values will rise.
I want to finish it here. I know obviously that you are not an expert in English lower league football, but if you were a sporting director for one of these clubs in League 1 or League 2, what questions would you be seeking the answers to? And, what should owners of these clubs be asking themselves?
I would be going over the language of the cap tooth and nail in an effort to find whatever loopholes I can find that would give me a competitive advantage over the other teams in the league. There will be teams that are forward-thinking and aggressive and take advantage of loopholes that give them a competitive advantage on the field. And so this is another way, I think, that you'll be able to distinguish the teams that are well-run and the teams that are not. And the teams that are well-run will be able to put a better team on the pitch, and ultimately will have more success.
Kieran Maguire is a football finance expert working at Liverpool University and co-host of the Price of Football podcast. Noah Croom worked in the NBA for more than 20 years, and he is currently General Counsel and Partner at the Beautiful Game Group. The music for this episode was provided under the Creative Commons license by Blue Dot Sessions, and you can find more information about those music tracks in our episode description. This episode was produced by John McKenzie. I'm Josh Schneider-Weiler, and thanks for listening to Football Today. And before you go, if you're a fan of the show and would like to support us, please sign up to our Patreon page where you'll get access to bonus episodes and extra content. And if you can't spare the cash, please tell a friend instead. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.